What if I told you the first presidential election in American history had no campaigns, no political parties, and no popular vote for the top job? In fact, the man who won didn't even want to run. Forget everything you know about modern elections, the attack ads, the massive rallies, the non-stop news coverage. America's first election in 1789 was a bizarre, messy, and almost accidental process that looks nothing like what we see today. It was less of an election and more of a nationwide scramble to hold a fragile new country together. To understand why it was so weird, we have to go back to 1789. The United States was a brand new country, barely held together by a freshly written constitution. Imagine a startup company on its first day of business, with no CEO, no rule book anyone had ever tested, and 13 very different, very stubborn regional managers. That was America. The states were deeply suspicious of a strong central government. People identified more as Virginians or New Yorkers than as Americans. There was a real fear that the whole experiment could collapse before it even started. There were no political parties like Democrats or Republicans. The founders actually hated the idea of parties, calling them dangerous factions that would tear the country apart. So with no parties and no campaigns, how do you even begin to choose a leader for this fragile new nation? The answer was a system that by today's standards seems incredibly confusing. The Constitution said the president would be chosen by electors, but it left it up to each state to decide how to pick those electors. And the states went in wildly different directions. In some states, like Pennsylvania and Maryland, male property owners could vote for their electors directly. But in most other states, the state legislature just appointed the electors themselves. The average person had no say at all. This meant the first election was really a collection of 13 separate mini-elections, each with its own set of rules. Imagine trying to follow an election where one state votes by text, another by mail, and a third just lets the governor pick the winner. It was that inconsistent. The entire process was slow, complicated, and a far cry from the idea of one person, one vote. So, who is everyone voting for? Well, there was only one name on everyone's mind: George Washington. He wasn't a candidate. He was a living legend. As the general who led the Continental Army to a miraculous victory against the British, he was the most trusted and respected figure in the nation. He was seen as the one person who could unite the squabbling states. He was the symbol of the revolution. But here's the crazy part. Washington didn't want the job. He was tired of public life and just wanted to retire to his farm at Mount Vernon. He made it clear he wasn't seeking the presidency. In fact, in the 18th century, openly campaigning for office was considered incredibly tacky and ambitious. It was seen as a sign that you were power-hungry and untrustworthy. Gentlemen were supposed to wait to be called to serve, not beg for votes. So Washington stayed silent, hoping someone else would step up, but nobody did. He was the only logical choice. This idea of not campaigning is one of the biggest differences between then and now. Today, a presidential election is a multi-billion-dollar industry with constant advertising, debates, and rallies. Candidates crisscross the country, shaking hands and kissing babies. But in 1789, there was none of that. Candidates were expected to show humility. The founders feared that ambition and self-promotion would lead to tyranny. They believed leaders should be chosen for their character and reputation, not for their ability to give a good speech or run a slick ad campaign. The idea was that public service was a duty, not a prize to be won. So instead of candidates attacking each other, there was just quiet expectation. Everyone knew Washington was the man for the job, even if he didn't want it. The election was less about choosing between different visions for the country, and more about convincing one man to accept a crown he didn't want. Now let's talk about the actual voting mechanism, because it was just as strange. Under the original system, each elector cast 2 votes. They couldn't just vote for one person for president. they had to write down two names. The person who received the most votes, as long as it was a majority, became president. The person with the second highest number of votes became vice president. It didn't matter if they were from different states, had different ideas, or even hated each other. This created the potential for some incredibly awkward political pairings. Imagine a modern election where the winner has to work with their main rival as their second in command. It was a system designed to find the two most respected leaders in the country, but it wasn't built for a world of political opposition. In this first election, the plan was simple. Every elector would use one of their two votes for George Washington. The second vote was where things got interesting, as it would determine who became the first vice president. When the electors from the 10 participating states finally cast their ballots, New York hadn't chosen its electors in time, and 2 other states hadn't ratified the Constitution, yet the result was historic. Every single elector, all 69 of them, cast one of their votes for George Washington. He was chosen unanimously, the only president in American history to ever achieve that. It was less of an election and more of a coronation. Washington's selection was a national consensus, a collective sigh of relief that the one man everyone trusted had agreed to lead. The runner-up, with 34 electoral votes, was John Adams of Massachusetts, who then became the first vice president. The system had worked, sort of, by producing a president everyone wanted and a vice president from a different region to create balance. But it was all based on the unique, unrepeatable fame of George Washington. Even with this unanimous outcome, the whole process was plagued by problems that seem unbelievable today. Communication was painfully slow. It took weeks for news to travel by horse and carriage. After the electors voted in February, it wasn't until April that Congress had a quorum to officially count the votes. There were no standardized ballots. Electors wrote names on slips of paper. Some electors didn't even show up to vote. Maryland had 2 missing electors, and Virginia had 3. The whole thing felt improvised and chaotic. There was no single election day like we have now. States voted over a period of weeks. It was a messy, disorganized affair that highlights just how new and uncertain everything was. By modern standards, it was an administrative nightmare. This strange first election set the stage for everything that followed. Its flaws quickly became apparent. The runner-up becomes vice president system created chaos in the next few elections, leading to the 12th Amendment, which separated the votes for president and vice president. The founders' fear of political parties gave way to reality, and by the next election, factions had already started forming, which would soon become the first political parties. The idea that candidates should campaign died out as the country grew and voters demanded to know who they were choosing. Over time, the power shifted from state legislatures to the people, as more and more states began allowing citizens to vote directly for electors. The simple, quiet, and confusing selection of 1789 slowly evolved into the massive, loud, and complex democratic process we recognize today. So the next time you see a presidential election, remember that first one. A silent candidate who didn't want the job, an electoral system full of quirks, and a country just hoping to survive. It was a far cry from the polished, professional, and often brutal campaigns of the modern era. It was a simple, strange, and essential first step in a long and messy journey of American democracy. Thanks for watching. If you found this interesting, don't forget to like and subscribe for more dives into forgotten history.